Ozzy does. He should handle it.
Yeah.
All right. Father in heaven, we come. We thank you for, as always, the privilege to go deep and to get into your word and to question ourselves at times. Traditions, assumptions, different things that maybe we've learned. We ask always that we would go back to your word and see if that's true or not. And so as we get into thinking about really the nature of rebellion, we ask that you would remind us of all that you've done for us in the gospel. And so we just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so being on session 13, that means we've had 12 previous ones, which is a lot of foundation that we've done. And but we're kind of switching over because one of the questions that we've been going through and asking is, again, if somebody was to ask us, why is the world the way it is today? How would we answer that question? And oftentimes, I think in the New Testament era, or I would say the American modern era, naturally we'd say, oh, well, it all started with Adam and Eve and Genesis 3. Genesis 1 and 2 is great. Things went down fast, and then rebellion took place and other things. So, but we also would say, Adam and Eve were not just left alone in their innocence. They were approached by some figure, which we'll talk about today. So over the next few weeks, what we'll do is, today we're going to cover kind of the background to Genesis 3, and then next week we'll get into the background to Genesis 6, with the sons of God coming down with mating with human women, and we'll get into all the details of that more particularly. And then the Tower of Babel will progress on that as well. So when you think about those level of 3 rebellions, you think about, again, Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 11, it's pretty conclusive at how we got to be where we are. And also, I think if we think about rebellion, we also need to think about the gospel. And not only that, but our eventual goal is to see how Jesus, in his mission, or God's mission, really throughout the rest of the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis 12 with Abraham, began to accomplish to redeem mankind from these 3 rebellions. And even in Jesus' ministry, how he overcame all of those. So that's kind of where we're heading. But how many of you have ever been taught or think that, if we go, let's do a little, I like timelines, you guys know that. Okay, so we have a timeline here. We'll just put the cross over here, and then we'll put eternity here. This might not be fair, but let's just do Genesis 1 here, and then Genesis 3 here. So, how many of you have ever been taught that sometime in history past, Satan rebelled and took a third of the angels with him? Right? And you say, well, just without looking at the sheet, how do we know that? What verses do we have to prove? There's a Revelation 12. That's kind of over here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's chronologically, I guess. It's interesting that we've all heard that, and I want to address that today as we get into Genesis 3 and this figure. So let's jump in there, right on the top sheet, to page 1 there, because we're moving. What do we know? Well, we know that at the creation of the earth, that the sons of God and the morning stars were rejoicing. So what we've been talking about as well is this, I'll put it up here if you guys are okay. I'll make it purple. How about that? That we have the heavenly realm, right? The unseen realm. And then down here we have the earthly physical realm. Okay? Earthly realm. And then there's this line here that God has put into place that keeps it separate. So there might be angels in this room. We don't know. God has said, I've kept that separate for now. But what we saw last time was that God has this spiritual family, the heavenly family, some of the angels. We've talked about all the hierarchy of that, and how they're part of the divine council behind the scenes. When God created Adam and Eve on earth, He gave us the earth to conquer and to rule over. But we also talked about the way that the Garden of Eden, possibly, we can't be 100% sure, was a place that where these realms blended together a little bit in perfect harmony. At least that was the intention. Because we know that God walked in the garden, right? That He walked in the cool of the garden, so He came down. He, is certainly spiritual. So He crossed over and joined them. That the garden in ancient literature and mountains and stuff was the abode of God. And so the goal was to have this perfect harmonious separation, but yet unity between the two groups. And so as we see that, we'll get into that a little bit more. But let's see. When do we know, or how do we know when Satan rebelled? What proof do we have?
Well, he had to have rebelled while Adam and Eve were still in the garden. Literally before that.
At least prior to that, right? That's kind of the latest. He had to be a fallen figure by the time he got to the garden to ask some questions, which we'll get to. But prior to that, it's interesting that some scholars. So let's look at Genesis 1 here, okay? Genesis 1 is the creation of what we described last time was the heavens and the earth. Okay. And at the end of Genesis 2, I think I have it on here. I don't know if at the end of Genesis 2 verse 1 says, the heavens and the earth were done. God created them and it was over. His completion, His creation was done. And all the host in them. Okay? So the question is, some scholars will say, who's the host? Let's see. I want to make sure that I'm quoting this right. Jerry, you got that? You got Genesis?
Yeah, I got Genesis 2:1, but mine doesn't say, mine says completed in all their vast array. You said heavenly host.
Yeah, well, the ESV says this. This is where you're going to have different perspectives. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And then on the seventh day, he goes on in different things. So the heavens and the earth were done, okay, and all the host. So some scholars will say, oh, well, who's the host there? Is that angels? Is that the angelic realm? Because if that's the case, then what we have is creation of even the host. This is interesting. The host of heaven is going to be, the creation is going to be, if they're the host that were existed prior, right? Because when the earth was created, they were there rejoicing. Well, Genesis 2:1 is referring and includes them. Now we have creation beginning before Genesis 1. And so that Genesis 1 is referring to that time period, okay? If you follow me, this is a little confusing, but...
So it's like an era rather than an event?
Correct.
Okay.
And I don't think that's what it's saying, because I think that these guys were existing here prior to the physical world. Why? Because they live up in the heavenly realm,
Right.
okay? The spiritual world. So when God comes down, He says, hey, I'm going to create a physical world, which is the heavens, space. And I'm going to create an earth for this new earthly family, this new physical family that I'm going to do. I'm doing something new here. I have my heavenly family. We're in the spiritual realm. I'm going to do something new. So what I think that the host there, the word, it doesn't tell us. It's the Hebrew word. It could mean angels. It could mean humans. It could mean the Egyptian, not Egyptian, but when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, they were called companies. You see that in company by company. And literally, in Hebrew, it's hosts by hosts. So,
stars.
Pardon?
Okay.
I think so.
Because that's in Psalms 33:6. That's what it is.
Yep. The hosts are the stars, because we see that in Genesis 1:14, so that when we have the record of Genesis 1, remember we saw that last time, God created the heavens, then He filled the heavens, He had the earth there, He shaped the earth and filled the heavens with physical things, stars, galaxies, all those wonderful things. Those are called the hosts. They're meant for signs of season. So that at the end of chapter 1, when we get to chapter 2, which we went into the rest of it, God finished creating the heavens and the earth and all the hosts, all the stars. Then He rested. And then He goes in verse 4, this is the account of how the history of that creation played itself out. And then we went and saw the Garden of Eden, chapter 2, and God putting man there. And now we're going to see that. So, the reason I bring that up is because at the end of chapter 1, He says, all of it was very good. So why does that create a problem?
Satan already rebelled.
Mm-hmm. So according to some scholars, they'll say, oh, well after, so let me say it this way. After God created everything, I'm going to move my line here just so I give myself more room. Let's put Genesis 3 here. So Genesis 1, Genesis 2. So we have 6 days, right? And then just for the sake of that, we'll put the 7th day here. All right? So after God created everything, He said at the end, it's very good. What would that imply? That Satan hadn't rebelled yet, right? If Satan and the hosts are part of that phrase of chapter 2, verse 1, God created in 6 days, formed the earth, created everything, including all of the angelic realm. It was all very good.
He said it actually made it holy. So if it's holy, it still is pure, right?
Separated, yeah, sanctified. He sanctified the 7th day. Holy, if you want to use that word. Mm-hmm. So, then that question becomes, Satan rebelled soon after the creation, but we don't know the time between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. It's kind of left open-ended. Was it a day, a week, a year, 5 years? We don't know.
So, let me just get this straight.
Yeah.
So that's if the hosts are referring to angels?
Correct.
Okay. So if it's referring to stars, then Satan could have rebelled way back
Way back here. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Is that we're trying to find out, when did this guy rebel? And we don't have a lot of information, but we're going to see something, we will see something about, and I'll even do this, for the sake of, only God is in eternity, right? Eternity past. But Genesis 1 is the beginning of the physical creation. Well, you can have angels here in their spiritual realm, and we have no problem with that. That shouldn't bother us. That angels were existing here, because Job 38:7 says that exact thing. When the earth was created, when its foundations were laid, the angels were rejoicing, so they were there. Okay. So, that being the case, there's some I want us to say that there's some confusion depending on what you read. Is like, for example, Ken Ham, who I like, he takes this position that Satan was created in here somewhere in one of the days, and he fell in there somewhere. Because, see, for them, the reason that Ken Ham is doing that is he's trying to argue against people believing that there's billions of years back here. So they put Satan's rebellion back here somewhere, and they go, see, because there's something called the gap theory, Satan rebelled, then there's billions of years of death and destruction, and then God recreated the earth here. So he's trying to avoid that. Naturally, when you try to attack a position, what do you usually do? Right? You swing to the other side.
Well, first you have to accept the concept that there was anything such as time prior
Correct.
to the heavens and earth being created, which the whole purpose of the moons and the stars and everything else was to keep track of time.
Yep.
And God is eternity, so why would there have to be any amount of time?
See, time if you're a physicist, time is a physical property, right? So we know that angels, they're relatively immortal. They're derivative, they're created beings. Are they outside of time? I don't know. All we know is that time is a physical property. Doesn't affect them because they're not physical. They're not bound by the physical laws, right? God is the only one who's eternal. So he created these guys. Somehow, time, which is physical, doesn't affect them. So, Genesis 1, when God created the heavens and the earth, that's the creation of physicalness, which would include length, height, width, and the fourth dimension being time. So when you start looking at physics and time being a dimension, it fits, relativity, Einstein, etc. Bob, Bill?
If the angels were a creation, and God is looking at his creations and says it's all very good, wouldn't we have to conclude at that point that the angels hadn't fallen yet?
That's what, like Ken Ham would say. When God says it's very good, is he speaking about the physical creation or all of creation, including the angels?
Here,
Does it have to mean, does very good need to mean most excellent? You know what I mean? Could he be saying, well, dealing with what I'm touching right now, this is great, and you see what I'm saying? He does, just because, does it have to
Be exhaustive, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah. The language, it would seem that it would be exhaustive because he's looking at, the references, he's referenced everything, it's been good, and he looked at everything that he had made. We could read
that's
that.
That's not the context, though. The context is the creation of the physical world.
That's
go
the
ahead.
Context.
well, because you got me kind of thinking, my NIV stuff, it sometimes refers back to the book of Jubilees. So I download it and start reading it, and there's a part about how the book of Jubilees in the first chapter says the angel, I just went back, doggone it.
Well, you find it, I want to read this. Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So do you have the exhaustive, everything that he had made? So that's the question. And it's not a huge deal, we're not going to spend too much time on it, but everything that he had made, what's the context? Does that include angels? Because if it does, at that moment, that means including Satan was still good. Bob?
At what point did Lucifer / Satan go from spiritual form to physical form?
Who says that he did? What makes you say that he did go to physical?
Well, in the Garden of Eden, he was in physical form.
Yeah. So what you do have is there's no doubt these angels can take on physical form. We see that all throughout biblical history, right? But taking on it doesn't mean that their base nature is physical, right? So, because they're spiritual beings for sure, but they can take what looks like human form. We see that in Genesis 19 with the two angels coming to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. They sit there. God even shows up there in physical form. Him and the two angels. They talk to Abraham. They eat. They go the next day, rescue Lot, and they depart. But we wouldn't assume that they're incarnated like Jesus. Most of us would believe that Jesus showed up in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord, showed up in what you would see as visible form, if you wanted to say it that way. Even such that, remember, they wrestled, the one angel wrestled with Jacob, so there's physical there. But that wasn't their base nature, where when Jesus comes down, who's spiritual, becomes incarnated, he takes that on permanently. So angels can show, but we don't want to assume that they took on physical form permanently, like Jesus in the incarnation. That's really, that would be...
Plus it was possession of the serpent rather than...
Correct. We're going to see that. Jerry, you got that?
Yeah, what happens here, there's several where it goes back and forth, and so I don't know which one is the best, but the one that seems to go is actually in 5, where it said this, and it's kind of strange the way they put it. It said, God commands the angel to write, and he said to the angel of the presence, write for Moses, from the beginning of creation till my sanctuary has been built among them for all eternity. So he's actually commanding, God commanded the angel of the presence. What do you think he's referring to?
The angel of the presence?
Yeah, presence. P-R-E presence.
You're reading the book of Jubilees, correct?
Yes, chapter 5.
I think the angel of the presence is the angel of Yahweh that you see in the rest of the Old Testament. So you got to throw him, and remember, Jubilees is interesting, but it's pretty wacky at times.
Yeah, I know. That's
Yeah, you
why
know. It's just interesting. You go, and sometimes it'll jump like Enoch. It'll jump all over the place, and you're like, what in the world is this?
Well, this is what it said. Then the angel of the presence spake to Moses according to the word of the Lord, saying, Write the complete history of creation. Now in 6 days the Lord finished all his works, and all he created, and kept the Sabbath on the seventh day, and hallowed it for all the ages, and he appointed it for a sign for all of his works.
Yes. So what Jubilees, they're giving you a history of Second Temple period, intertestamental period. They're giving their history of all the way from the beginning, the Jubilees, the every 50 years, going all the way through. So
But
it's
Moses
really
was the one that wrote Genesis, right?
that's.
He had to get it from someplace. He
You know
wasn't
what?
there.
I will say this, that there's no way to prove that Moses wrote Genesis. Nowhere. I believe it's true, but
Who knows?
I mean, I've tried to document that, and you can't prove it. But ultimately, isn't. Okay, so with that as a kind of an intro, let's jump into Revelation 12, because the question for us is, I kind of want to hammer this a little bit, to say, what do we know, what can we know about this idea of Satan rebelling back here and whipping down a third of the angels? If we believe that, what's our text? And the text is Revelation 12. So, I'll just read this and then we'll go through some of the points because we'll keep moving. Right there on your sheet. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled to the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And detailed when it comes to interpreting the book of Revelation. So, number one there, this section of Scripture, you'll see this word sometimes, pericope. You ever heard that word? Pericope is just like a paragraph or a section of scriptural text. Oftentimes it's like a parable. Jesus will give a parable, and it's like 8 verses, sometimes it's 3 verses, depending on context. So I just threw that in there to introduce you to new words. Okay, this section is in the genre of apocalyptic literature. Clearly, number 2, there's figurative language, right? It says there was a sign, and then there was another sign. So we understand that the default is to take all of Scripture in its normal reading, unless you're in a specific genre like poetry, or apocalyptic, or parable. You know, you're looking at similes and metaphors. We understand language. Our default is to take language, I don't want to say literal, because sometimes people have a problem with that. I would say take all of language in its normal way, literal way,
At face value.
at face value, unless it's telling you something. So again, we often say, it's raining cats and dogs. We understand idioms. We understand similes. I was hungry as a horse, Scripture uses that language, and we're not scared of it. But we also don't want to then go, this is the book of Revelation. Everything's now become spiritual, allegorical, or typological, metaphorical, all those things. And then we just start going, well, what does it mean to you? Well, what does the red dragon mean to you? And then, what does it mean to you? Because pretty soon, that's why you get all this convoluted stuff out there. Convoluted interpretations of the book of Revelation, because people run with the symbols. And I think it's important for us that the book of Revelation naturally is last. There's over 800 allusions. What's an allusion?
Reference.
Yeah, references, 800 hints or connections to the Old Testament in 400 verses. So what the book of Revelation assumes is that you have read the previous 65 books. Not just read them, but are intimately acquainted with them. Because if we don't do that, for example, Revelation 13, it talks about there being different kingdoms, or it says, "Yeah, I saw I saw a bear, I saw a lion, and what was the other one?
Leopard.
A leopard." And you go, "Oh, well, what does the bear mean to you, Emily? What about the lion? Oh, the lion. Well, that's Jesus, because we know Revelation 5:5, Lion of the tribe of Judah." But if you go back to Daniel 7, there they are. So we don't have to assume and make them mean what we want, because you go back to the book of Daniel and you see them highlighted in what they mean and what they are referring to. Okay, so 3. I find it interesting too that if you were to take a hyper-literal translation of Revelation 1:1, it says, "The apocalypse, or the unveiling of Jesus Christ, that the Father gave him," Jesus, "who then turned around and signified it to his angel and then to John." Signified it, you think. And the literal word is, he signified it. He took this apocalypse, this unveiling of Jesus, put it into signs, gave it to the angel who gave it to John, and then he went on. But we also know that not everything is symbolic. He's writing to the churches, right? To the church at Laodicea, to the church at Ephesus. You have this, you're doing well here, and I have this against you. And so then he begins to outline these things to them. In the first chapter of Revelation, John sees the risen Jesus. And he's in these priestly garments, he's in a robe, his hair is white. His voice is like many waters, his eyes are like flames of brass, and feet. And you go, "Oh, wow." I mean, is Jesus walking around like that? Not necessarily, but that was the image. But then we know the hard part of Revelation is to know when it's speaking in normal language, face value, and when it's bringing signs. But here we don't have to guess. A great sign appeared. Okay. Is this a literal woman? I don't think so, because it's telling us this is a sign. So what we do know is, I've given you number 3 there, the characters: pregnant woman, a child, a dragon, a third of the stars, Michael, and then the dragon's angels. Those are who we're talking about here. Number 4, chronologically, we are around the time of Jesus' birth. How do I know that? Verse 2, right? A woman, she's pregnant. Well, how do you know that that's Jesus' birth? Okay, well, let's go to 5. Here we have a male. The woman was giving birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations. Well, that's clearly Jesus, right? I've given you there in number 5, Revelation 2:27, Revelation 19. We also know Psalm 2 speaks about Jesus ruling the nations. So clearly this is a reference to Jesus' birth. Okay? Number 6, the dragon drew down a third of the stars after the woman became pregnant. When is this exactly? So if we're going to come over here with our time frame, and we put here, let's just say the typical thing is 4 BC. All right? Jesus was born in 4 BC. That's the typical scholar. So, I just got different colors. Okay. So if we do the woman here, she's pregnant. So she's pregnant, I don't know, almost at 5 BC, right? So if we put 5 BC, in here somewhere is where we have Satan, or the dragon, dropping a third of the stars down. How does that help us? Is that when the rebellion took place? Is that when Satan rebelled? No, we know he rebelled prior to Genesis 3. So you see what happens now? We have a chronology here, because if we look at verse 5, the child was born, and then the child, boom, was caught up to God's throne. Well, when did that happen? Roughly 33 AD. So now we have 4 BC. Well, it's over here actually, after the cross. Let's just say 33 AD. Now we have a period of Jesus' life. That's why I think I said it on here. Maybe I didn't. We have at least 34 years now jumping around. You follow? So I think the chronology is solid. It's sequential is a better word. But it's jumping. And it's giving us this overall portrait of something, of this sign of what it's trying to present in Revelation 12. But what we know is that the third of the stars being swiped, which I think this is clearly a reference to angels. We know that in chapter 1 in the book of Revelation. The stars are angels, most likely. It didn't happen here. So this idea that at the time of some rebellion in the past, which we know he rebelled in ancient past, that he swiped a third of the stars, how do you prove that? You don't.
Well, there's a few things. I think there's room for a huge gap between verse 6 and 7. Because he was caught up to his throne, and then the woman fled into the wilderness, and then the war broke out.
Yep.
Okay. So, but when he goes down further, they did not prevail, nor was there a place found for them in heaven any longer. But we know prior to all this that Satan was there with the sons of God in heaven, speaking against everyone.
He's an accuser, right? Yeah. So I agree with you that from verse 5, which is here we go, 33 AD, to the next thing that we see in the text is the woman, which we haven't talked about her just yet. The woman flees. Okay, for 1,260 days. We also know that that's 3.5 years. Okay, so this is, and then time and half a time, which in the book of Daniel and in Hebrew has what they call a dual ending. We don't have that in our language. If we have singular and plural, right? Well, in Hebrew, if you say like the word shanaim is the word for year. And if you say, hi, how long you been here? And you say shnaim, they're going to go, oh, 2 years. Because the way that it's worded versus many years, or unlimited amount of years, depending on which number I put on there. So in Hebrew, what it's saying here is, in Daniel anyway, because this phraseology comes from Daniel. You have time. What do you imagine time is? 1. You have times, which is a dual, which is 2. And then you have a half a time. So if you add all those up, what do you have?
3.5.
3.5. Oh, well, that's consistent with 1,260 days. So you have, again, all I'm saying is you have consistency here in that regard. And we'll see later, if you look at other passages in the book of Revelation, it'll say, what's 3.5 years in months? 42. So consistency all the way through. So the question is, we have a jump from the woman being pregnant to here. They jumped all the way across the cross and everything to the ascension. And now we have another jump, which now the woman is fleeing. How long is that? Depends on your interpretation of the book of Revelation.
How long is that?
How long is this period here of jumping? We know this one was 34 years.
All right.
That's my question. Now all of a sudden the woman's fleeing. So let's go to number 7. Yeah.
Could that be referencing from Bethlehem to Egypt?
That was my take.
Could be. So, but the woman is fleeing after the ascension. Right? Is that what you're seeing? Sequentially? Let's see.
Well, you're talking about sequentially, but we're not.
But if it's joined sequential, then they fled after Christ was
Ascended.
died and ascended to heaven. So it couldn't be Bethlehem being
So what do you?
It couldn't have been Bethlehem.
Are we talking Mary here? Because
That's the question. Let's answer that question, and then we'll ask, because that's the question. It would be,
Well, verse 6 throws wrench here as far as consistency
well, it's not a wrench unless we have a preconceived idea,
goes. Right.
right?
I have a preconceived idea.
Okay. That's the thing. Let's let the text
On
speak.
one hand, you ask us to follow a storyline,
Yes.
and on the other hand, for instance, let's go back a few scriptures. We know that the woman is not a woman. It's a sign.
It's a sign.
It's a
So,
sign.
well, okay.
Okay.
Well, hold your thought.
Okay.
Let's answer who's the woman. Okay. Number 7, I said the woman is clearly Israel. Well, Mondo, you're just whipping this out. You're just making things up. Well, no, because we know the Old Testament. Now, what's the woman? How is she described? The sun, the moon, and a crown of 12 stars. That only appears one place in the entire Bible, and I've given it to you right at the bottom. Joseph, the dreamer, says this, I saw it, now he had still another dream, and it related to his brothers, and he said, Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, do you think I'm making the connection here up? I think this is tight. This is the only place in the entire Bible. If we took Genesis 37:9 out, 9 through 11, then it would be, Emily, what does the sun, moon, and the stars mean to you? What does it mean to you, Jerry? And we would be able to just fill in whatever we wanted. But because we're connecting to the Old Testament, it says very clear here, he related, verse 10, he related the dream to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream that you have? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come down to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? Jacob says, okay, if we were to go over here,
So that's the beginning of all Israel. That's what it is, right? Because that's
let's just do some correspondence, okay? You're talking theology. You're going too fast.
Jacob is Israel.
Okay,
That's right.
Here's the sun. Okay, we'll make the moon lesser. And then you have, I'm not going to write them all out, but 12 stars. Okay. In the dream, how many are there? There's 11. Okay? In Revelation, there's 12. According to Jacob, who's the son?
His father.
Which is Jacob, right? Jacob says, hey, are you saying that me and your mother and your brothers are going to bow down to you? So if we take this collectively, because she has a garland with a sun and a moon and 12, but Joseph's are obviously having the dream, so he is the 11 brothers are bowing down to him. Okay, so we're still not stretching anything, but collectively, who does this refer to?
Israel.
Israel, right? We always talk about Jacob and his sons. That is collectively Israel. We're not reaching here. So if we take this image then, and we say that there's no doubt in the Old Testament, Israel is considered the wife of God, the bride of bride. We know that. We're not stretching anything. That this is a woman. So when we get to the book of Revelation, he says, hey, I saw a sign. And instead of just saying Israel, it's putting it in a sign. I saw this woman. So now the woman is giving birth to Jesus. The woman is not Mary, even though Mary was the individual vessel. There's no doubt that, for example, in Romans 9, Paul is talking about the blessings of being part of the covenant. He says, man, being part of the covenant is great. From Israel comes the covenants, the promises, and the Messiah. So he's speaking collectively in Romans 9 as the blessings of being a part of that group, the corporate group. And one of the things he mentions there is the woman brought forth, again, the law, the covenants, and the Messiah. Okay? So, again, very consistent. So, if we throw Israel now in here, Israel brought forth the Messiah 4 BC. No problem. Okay? Fast forward, the Messiah, that child, gets boom, and then all of a sudden now the woman is fleeing after the ascension. Sequentially. We don't know how long. So the,
Can't wrap my head around it.
Is it because they're waiting for the second coming of Christ when Israel will be judged?
it depends on your perspective, right? So what I'll give you my answer, which
Let's do that.
I could spend another half hour giving you the answer or the defense of it. Let's see.
But as far as like prophetic literature, I was just listening to, I was trying to find where it was, but I was listening to either Haggai or Zephaniah or something like that. And there's a lot of jumping around traditionally. And so if you're used to it, it doesn't pose as much as a problem.
Oh yeah, if you're an Old Testament person.
It's just like, that's because the guy, I can't remember where it was, but he's like, I was listening to all of them in a block, so I'm really confused about which one. But he would say, when is this going to happen? And it will say, this is going to happen, and then a long stuff, there's going to be a lot of time, and then this is going to happen. And yet he gave him the vision all in one. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So
it's amazing that, for example, there's several examples all through the prophetic literature in the Old Testament. One of the best examples, Jerry, since you like to read Isaiah 61,
Isaiah 61.
verse 1 and 2. And this is a quote. Jesus comes, his first sermon, officially, is in Luke chapter 4 when he goes to the synagogue. And he gets up to read. And he reads Isaiah 61.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, and because the Lord has appointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance on our God, to comfort the vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn.
Okay,
that's fantastic.
so here we have, Jesus is reading Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. Comfort, preach the gospel to the poor. This is all delivered, captives. This is awesome. To bring in the acceptable year, the favorable year of the Lord. And then he stops. And in English, there's a comma there. In Hebrew, they don't have punctuation. The next phrase is, and the day of vengeance. So in that little comma, in English, how long is that?
Well, it's been over 2,000 years.
It's been 2,000 years. And you go, if you were to read that, if you were an Old Testament person prior to Jesus, you would expect when the Messiah came, he was going to come preach the gospel, and then immediately judgment was coming. And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, because there's no indication in that, between the two words, that there's 2,000 years there. Zechariah 9:9 says the same thing. You look at that passage where it talks about the king is coming to you on a donkey, and then right next to it is judgment. And you go, oh, the king's coming on a donkey, here he is, let's worship him, and then he's bringing deliverance.
That's why they could not conceive of him dying on the cross, because he's supposed to rule and take care of all the enemies.
Yep.
Right then.
So, all this being said is,
They were correct.
don't get tangled up or be offended or be upset, in the sense, because this jumping around, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you go, this is no problem. How long is this? I don't know. Is it 1,000 years? Is it 1,000 days? Is it 2,000 years? I think that it jumps from here immediately into the middle of the tribulation. Future. Long time.
So is there waves of rebellion? Like, because we know that Satan has angels that are, Satan, there's fallen angels now, we get that. But then if it jumps to the future, then there's like another rebellion.
It would seem that according to the sequence here, which the sequence is tight, okay? It's not jumping back and forth. It's just jumping forward. The woman 4 BC, at that time, there is these 1/3. So,
Okay, wait. The woman
know
4 BC, we're speaking directly to the physical mother of Christ.
No.
No.
Not necessarily.
No, it's talking about
It includes
Not
that.
necessarily. I understand the nation.
It includes that. Of course it does, because obviously the woman corporally didn't give, sheep.
No, but we're talking Israel.
So at that time,
In Israel, at the time thereof.
was there an additional rebellion of a third of the angels at the time?
If the timeline is only
Sequential.
going forward, then it would tend to lead me to say, yes, there is an additional rebellion. Because Christ healed the woman of the 1,000 demons, the legion, when Christ was on earth. So there had been a rebellion pre-him.
Pre-ministry,
Right.
right? Because remember,
Pre-him on earth, yeah.
so here's his 3.5 year ministry, 3.5, 3.5 years. So prior to that, there's no doubt, as you said, when Jesus shows up to start his ministry, it's like demons on every corner.
Yeah, they're out in force.
There's no doubt. There's nothing in the text that would tell me that we're jumping backwards and forward in time.
There's nothing.
Yeah, that's where I got stuck.
There's nothing here to say either that this is when the rebellion started. There's nothing to say that. This is just a war.
Well, we haven't got to the war yet.
Could it be a refresher course?
Well, the war is, we see here that the war is verse 7, right? So the woman flees. Now all of a sudden, simultaneously, right at that, I would even put it closer here, you have this war in heaven. And then you have Satan being cast down in a very unique and special way with his angels, knowing that his time is short. See, to me, prophetically speaking, the thing that makes the most consistent sense throughout all of Scripture, and again, I'm giving you the 3-minute version, is that this is the midpoint of the tribulation. The woman is now being persecuted. She's sending out, it's time of Jacob's trouble, Jeremiah 37. She's going out there. The Antichrist comes down. The abomination of the desolations happen, Matthew 24:15. The greatest tribulation that's ever existed in the history of the world is happening here. Satan comes down. His time is short. Why? Because Jesus is coming back 3.5 years. He's got a lot to do. He goes to persecute the woman. Why? To prevent her, to kill her, to annihilate all the Jews. Why? So that Jesus can't come back. Because Jesus comes back. Why does Jesus come back?
So his kingdom.
Specifically, well,
To judge Israel, right? He is
no. Actually, the opposite.
to redeem Israel.
Jesus comes back to rescue Israel because what did he say in Matthew 23? He said, "You will not see me again until what?"
Well, they look upon the one that they pierced and
Well, that's Zechariah 12. I think that's exactly right. You will not see me again until you say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." We know as well that passage is almost identical to the book of Hosea, where the Messiah says, "I'm going to go away back to my place until they acknowledge their offense," which is that, the one whom they pierced, "and then I'll come back and get them." So Jesus is waiting until they ask him to come back. That's Matthew 23. So we're getting off. But I'm just simply to say that at the time of her fleeing, there's this war that takes place. Satan comes down. You have the abomination of desolation, where they based on the book of Daniel, 2 Thessalonians 2, the Antichrist comes in, what? To declare himself to be God. Where? In the temple. So you see all these things, and what I'm saying to you is there's 10 different layers here that are beautifully consistent. All these different passages, all of Daniel, that when the woman flees in the war in heaven, it's for this short period of time, which we know is how long? 3.5 years. It says it.
We know that.
Could it be that, like, the Satan and his fallen angels are trying to get back into the heavenly realm because he's cast out of the heavenly realm? And if I remember right, like Satan had access.
He had access
to the heavenly realm, like all the way back Job and all that, right?
I would think so.
And this is where, like, God says, "Okay, now you no longer have access."
I think that God initiated the war, the removal, not Satan. I don't think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like,
Yep. God said,
God cast the
time is short.
the dragon out.
Michael, get him out of here.
Get him out of here.
No more access.
No more access.
Force him down,
Yeah.
and he knows his time is short. So to me, if we jump around here, the latest date that we have for sure is 34 AD. Let's say 33 AD. Jesus' ascension. If the woman is now fleeing, historically, it's hard to see because at that same time, Satan is cast down, has his access gone, and he has a short time. Well, short time, I guess, could have lasted 2,000 years. And historically speaking, we could jump to 70 AD potentially when Israel was taken out of the land, which is possible. But she comes back. And we don't have it's not exhaustive in Revelation 12, because I think Revelation 12 is relatively exhaustive until, and for her to flee for 3.5 years, that would lead, that's from 34 AD. You know what I'm saying? If we jump to 70 AD, well then she said 73 AD, and then you go, well, what happened next? Because what you see is kind of a finality there in the chapter.
So you're saying this point from 70 AD to beginning of Israel again,
48.
48 was it? 48?
Yeah.
That's that period.
It then would be going, well, now we have a whole bunch left out. But if we see it as being consistent with all the other things I gave, then we go, oh, this is still potentially future. Okay, my main goal, we did a disservice on this, okay? My main goal was to say that this whole idea of Satan bringing down a third back here, unwarranted. That was my whole point, spending 30 minutes.
Well, did we learn a lot?
It doesn't fit.
It doesn't fit. If you want to believe that Satan rebelled in eternity, or somewhere before Genesis 3, and he took down a third of the angels, this passage is not going to help you.
Okay.
That's my whole point.
And he wouldn't have had access to the throne to be accuser of anybody because he would have already been cast down to earth.
Correct. It would have been cast down back then.
So what's happening in Genesis 6?
Well, it's the first.
That's a different rebellion, which we'll get to. But what we have here is, the title of this section, this session, is at least one heavenly rebellion. Satan. That's all we can prove.
One for sure.
One for sure, and then how he comes and affects Adam and Eve. When we get to Genesis 6, which is just, it's a short time in scripture, in passages, because it's a few chapters, but there's, hundreds and hundreds of years between when they were in the garden and then the things that happened in Genesis 6.
Have you ever seen any connection that you can make between the cause of the rebellion being because God created mankind?
In the sense of we're trying to give motive for why Satan rebelled?
Because he obviously wants our worship.
He does want worship.
He wants to be in God's place, but there are already angels in existence prior to the creation of the earth and heavens. So any of those, he could have had that motivation before.
We know what his motivation is as it relates to himself. What we don't know is why he targeted Adam and Eve. Specifically.
He must have had some sense of what God's plan was.
Yeah. He didn't want to share. Because remember, this earthly, God was inviting us to be a part of that heavenly council. But our domain was earth. Their domain is the heavens, the spiritual realm, the unseen realm. Okay, did he not like it? Did Satan be like, hey, I don't like these guys. I want part of the physical realm as well. Or who knows what. What we do know, let's keep going. We got time. We'll make it quick. Ezekiel 28, I'm not going to read it because then we won't have time. But I'll give you the summaries here. That most scholars believe that in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, you have the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon. But that there's no way that the writer is not referencing the individual, but as well as the power behind the individual. So what you do see is these kings sin in such a way that it reminds Ezekiel and Isaiah, hey, well, your arrogance reminds me of the original arrogant guy. And so they begin to speak in like father, like son, right? Because we know you're a child of God or you're a child of the devil. So that's pretty clear. So number one there, the king of Tyre was undoubtedly not in the Garden of Eden. How do we know that? Because it says, take a lamentation over the king, you were in Eden. Verse 13. How do we know the king of Tyre was not in Eden?
There was no Tyre.
Time, the flood had happened, right? You know, plus the fact there was a cherub that was guarding. Remember, the cherub was guarding. You couldn't get into Eden anymore. You know, at least in the garden. Well, there it says you were in Eden, the garden of God. So all access to humanity was gone. So clearly this is not talking to the literal king. It's talking to some figure behind him. Okay? Number 2, he is called the seal of perfection. But literally it's what's a participle in English? Give me one example of participle. This is good. Good for grammar. Yeah. If I had a 3rd grader in here, they'd be able to tell me.
Is that like a helping verb instead?
This
Oh, it's the ending.
I haven't done math.
always ing, running, fighting, singing. Those are participles. They're right there. They're verbs, but they're kind of like both, like noun and verbs all together. So, anyway, so you have this idea of this. He was a sealer, not the seal, because it says if you were the seal of perfection, that's a noun. This is, you were one who was sealing things. And the word also can mean serpent, which is fascinating. He's described as perfect, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. He's being described with various jewels, which speak of luminescence or shining. That's important. Number 5, he was an anointed guardian cherub. Okay? He was in the mountain of God. He walked among the stones of fire, which again, it speaks about other divine counsel in the imagery. He was created. He wasn't eternal. Became unrighteous. Number 9, he was trading. This is interesting. Verse 16, by the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you out. This idea of some versions, it's really fascinating if you look at some of the English versions of this word. What does it mean? Help me out here. This is fun. Okay. Any day traders in here? There we go. We got one. Okay. In the abundance of his trading, another word that I think it was the ASV, says merchandising. Okay, what's a merchandiser?
Buyer and seller.
Buyer and seller. So the question is, what was he selling? Think about what's Satan selling?
Lies.
Rebellion. So he's going around somewhere, sometime. Hey, I got an idea. Okay, join me in my cause, so to speak. Through that, he became filled with violence. Number 10, he was cast out from God's immediate abode and removed from divine council membership. How do we know that? Because he was removed from the stones of fire, which again is speaking of this. 11, he was filled with pride and became corrupt. We know that 1 Timothy 3:6, talking about eldership. Hey, you can't have a novice there because he might become proud and fall in the same way that the devil did through pride. So clearly, we have a guarantee that we know that he fell through pride. Interesting too, verse 18. By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, there it is again, you profaned your sanctuaries. Now that's really interesting. Because remember, one of the things remember what we saw last time. All right, let's try to keep that open over here. We had Yahweh here, right? And then, this way. And then right around him we had the cherub. And then we also had the seraphim, right? These were the throne guardians. And then we had the divine council, the other like Michael, Gabriel, the sons of God. And then down here we had all those that were just the ministering angels, okay? That was part of our hierarchy. Remember, in the Old Testament, the cherub guarded sacred space. We see that as well, remember when they were cast out, Genesis 3:22, once they were cast out, the cherub was set there to guard this sacred space that was God's throne, that was this connection between, if we put here the garden was this connection between the heavens, the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. Once they got cast out, the cherub was put there to guard it. And he says, so it's interesting that this word sanctuaries is this idea of sacred space. And he said, think about it this way. Satan, you profaned, number one, you were the guardian cherub, and you profaned your sacred spaces by your violence. So he was an anointed, and that's fascinating too. He was an anointed cherub. That's the word for Messiah. The word Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. I find it interesting that Satan had that title of anointed one. Not only that, but he was the anointed one sitting around guarding sacred spaces. Most likely he was part of God's personal bodyguard. But he happened to be, and he was luminescent. Jewels, all these things that would retell you. If you want to describe light in figurative language, you would speak about diamonds and emeralds and rubies and wow, oh yeah, you take a diamond and you see it sparkle and all those other, okay.
Also, it's these twisted scripture, as it were, that created this theology about saints and Jesus being broken.
Right, that's true. Okay, on the bottom there, Isaiah 14, we're going to go really quick. How you have fallen from heaven, shining one. This word is shining one. It's not the word, O star of the morning. The word star doesn't appear here in Hebrew. That's why I crossed it out. Some of the newer versions will reflect that. There's a very specific word, kokav for Hebrew, or for star, and it doesn't appear here. How you have fallen from heaven, shining one, son of the dawn. You've been cut down to earth. You've weakened the nations. And he goes on. And I've given you in the number 1 through 5 there, the 5 I wills of this figure. I will ascend to heaven. So he got cast out, remember? He was up here around the throne and he had direct access. So he was cast out of his position. I've cast you out of my, we saw that in Ezekiel, I've cast you out of the throne, the mountain of God. But he says, no, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above. Here we have the stars of God. These are the council members. Here we have the sons of God. The stars of God appears in the Job 38, 6 and 7 passage. The morning stars there. And the sons of God. There you have them put in right connection to each other. The morning stars and the sons of God. And here, Satan has been removed. And he says, you know what? These guys have authority. But I'm going to take my throne. And I want to be above these guys because I'm worthy. I'm more worthy than them. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. This is this language here in Isaiah 14 comes, I wouldn't say it's coming out of the city of Ugarit. We talked about Ugarit, which is just north of Israel in modern day Syria, or Lebanon and that up there. But the Canaanite religion, they had this exact same language about God dwelling in the recesses of the north on the Mount of Assembly. Identical in secular. So Isaiah is saying, let me give you the true version, like we talked about. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. What's Jesus coming on? The clouds. It's interesting. Do a study of clouds. It's really fascinating. That's always a reference to deity or divinity or to God's throne or God's majesty or God's glory. Jesus, even when the rapture happens, what happens? We ascend and we gather together where? In the clouds. It's kind of fascinating. He says, I'm gonna ascend above the clouds. I will make myself, the key word in number 6 is like the Most High. He's not looking to honestly replace the Most High. He's like him. He knows that he can't beat the Creator. At least you would assume that, in the sense of displacing him because he's all powerful. But his motive here is, I want to be like him. Well, what's that mean? Well, we know in Revelation 13, according to the rest of this last 3.5 years, in Revelation 13, it's all about worshiping the dragon, worshiping the beast. Worldwide worship. And so God says, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to let you have your time. I'm going to give you your 3.5 years of worship. And I'm going to use that as a test for mankind to see if they'll worship you or they'll worship me. That's really what you see in the broader scope of the book of Revelation, or the time of the tribulation. It's primarily about Israel, getting them to a place of absolute destruction so they'll repent and they'll call out on the name of Jesus. You know, you see that in Zechariah 13, where it talks about them, 2/3 of them are going to be annihilated and 1/3 will be brought through. And that's the 1/3 by the time they get to the end, after they fleed. 1/3, massive Holocaust, twice as bad as 1940s. Tribulation, Jesus said in Matthew 24:15, beyond what's never been in the earth, never will be again. So this tremendous period here. But in the greater thing, the world, you see in the book of Revelation, you see this phrase, the earth dwellers. The earth dwellers worship the beast. The earth dwellers take the mark of the beast. The earth dwellers are the ones that perish. Versus, we're not of the earth, right? Where's our citizenship? It's in heaven. So it's fascinating to use that language. Number 7, the shining one. He says, I will, I will, I will. God says, no, you will be thrust down. You want to talk about what's going to happen. And then in Genesis 3 now, so what we're doing here is Revelation 12 has nothing to do with what happens prior, but it seems that Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 do make reference to Satan's motives and his rebellion. And so we have all of that background of what he wanted, his trading, and now he shows up in chapter 3 verse 1, now the serpent. And the word Nachash here is the word shining one. It can, and it is translated serpent. But I think if you were a Jewish person reading this, you'd be like, oh, this has got more than one meaning. This is like a triple entendre. You know, if you want to look at these different layers, yeah, it's a serpent, but it also, you'd go, because nechoshet in Hebrew is the word for copper and bronze. It's shiny, it's polished. It's really fascinating. So this shining one appears, and we know the story, but number 2 there. Well, let me give you let's do another little English test here, okay? Not that you guys, it's good for us.
So well.
So remember, I'll give you the best English example. In Hebrew, all of the words are they call them, they're 3 letters, okay? All the root words are 3 letters. And then you build off those roots. All kinds of nouns, participles, everything, verbs. Okay, we do the same thing in English. So if I said, what does that say without vowels?
He went to the stars.
He went where?
The stars.
Stars? Well, there'd be an S on here.
Stores.
He went to the store. Or he went to the star. See how it's kind of, in Hebrew there's no vowels. So all you have is consonants. So you have to fill in. Okay? But you guys did well. Okay? Because you know this. That's what makes it really hard to learn modern Hebrew, because all the vowels are gone and all the helpers are gone. So when you read the modern day Israeli newspapers, it's really hard. The Bible's not the same way. So in English, with this root, what words can I make with that?
Sing.
Sing, sang, song, sung. Just using this. Sing is a verb, song is a noun, sung is past tense. You see how that we do that?
Snug.
You can make snug there, yeah?
Snag.
Snag? This is what Hebrew, you have to say, well, what's the context here? But we use this to create a whole bunch of words, simply triliteral root systems. Okay. The word for Nachash here also is the word for diviner. The shining one is a diviner. What's a diviner? Someone who says the world's together. the physical world, a diviner says, hey, I can access the spiritual realm, the unseen realm. And I can talk to your dead ancestor. So what Satan was doing is, and you see the rest of it, it's very forbidden in the Old Testament. Diviners were to be put to death because this thing here, this connection that was there in the garden, was eliminated. God said, nope, we're breaking that now because now we have rebels in the camp, and I don't want that connection to stay. So he eliminated it. And now, unless God, sometimes he'll send angels down to talk to Mary and talk to Daniel. But for the most part, we are not allowed to access that except God himself. But Satan's children are diviners, and they come along and they offer, hey, I can get you to the other side. I can give you power. So, just briefly here, you guys know all this. The Shining One cast down on what God said. He contradicted what God said. And then he cast down on God's motives as being good. Sin occurred and thrust humanity into sin and death for them and their posterity. I do want to read verse 5, though. He's speaking to Eve, and he says, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like the gods, knowing good and evil. The word is Elohim. It is a plural word. And so here's what we get to. In the garden, remember we said that there was a good blend of the unseen, the heavenly, with the earthly. So it's fascinating to me, and I'm sure you've thought of this, is why was she not surprised that some shining creature was talking to her? She's used to it.
More than familiar with it.
That's a little speculation, but I think it's reasonable. Because otherwise, she'd be like, well, who are you? It's just been me and Adam. And God occasionally takes a walk in the garden and we talk to him. But who are you? So he's saying, and for him to make reference, he says to Eve, hey, God's leaving something out. You know all these other guys up here, remember? You guys were made in our image. And in Genesis 3:22, when God speaks, the man and the woman have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. These beings up here, God himself, does God know good and evil? He says that he's become like one of us. God doesn't know it experientially, but he knows it theoretically or philosophically, whatever. And these other heavenly beings also knew that. But Adam and Eve, in their innocence, had no concept of that. And Satan tempts her and says, don't you want to be like all the other people? Don't you want to be like the other Elohim, the other gods, to know good and evil? See what God's doing? He's put you down here in this physical realm, and you're missing out. You're not going to be like us.
What was the definition? What was the actual meaning of evil? Do we know?
The Hebrew word is ra, R-A, and it can mean anything from adversity to moral evil and rebellion, transgression. So, bad attitude is considered raw, evil. So we want to come in with our Greek mind and go, oh, let's talk about what the philosophical definition of moral evil is. But in reality, it's just a knowledge of good, and good is a moral term. So, I mean, we could run with that as it creates like a juxtaposition there between good and bad.
Well, this is a contradiction because of Genesis where God said, and he saw that it was good. You know, his actions, evil contradicts those actions. And that I'm not trying to get off the path. Go ahead, finish.
Let me add one last thing here, okay? Okay. Okay. Genesis 3:1. The temptation at this moment is the offer of knowing evil and good. Okay? Well, it's interesting that how did evil even exist? To be known even by God and the other Elohim.
Satan would have at least had to rebel before them.
Yes.
At
So
least Satan.
So all we have Satan at the minimum. Evil has already existed. God has already known about it, and the other people in the divine council already knew about it too. Enough that Satan come down and say, they already know about it. Don't you want to be like them to know about it? If you eat of it, you'll be like the gods. And what she should have said was, where did that come from? I know what good is, because God's declared everything good. We've been talking to him. But he would have to admit, well, of course, he was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. So, as we summarize, we have some hints, but we don't have exhaustive knowledge. But secondly, this is the beginning of the rebellion. We have the heavenly rebellion, and we also have the earthly rebellion. And we go, how did we get here? I mean, I'm not trying not to spend too much time on Genesis 3 because it's so well known. That was a rebellion. And then, so next time, we'll get into the next rebellion, at least on a cosmic scale. Is this a cosmic scale? This is cosmic, okay? Because this is where you have a guy coming from the heavenly realm, invading in the earthly existence and causing trouble. And then in Genesis 6, we're going to see something similar happen. Okay? Bob, wrap us up here.
Well, just real quick application, the idea that we live by faith. We don't need to experience evil. So we can be God-like by living by faith.
Yeah.
Instead of God knowing it theologically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
not experientially, but
yeah,
sure.
So we're invited just to know evil by faith. Or by trusting.
Yep. All right. Well, let's pray. Father, we do thank you for your word, and there's so much richness here, and there's a lot of little bit here, a little bit there, but help us to continue to try and tie it all together so that as we think about, again, the goal is to think about Jesus and his work on the cross and how he undoes this rebellion and he overcomes it and he humiliates it and you get vindicated in all of it. So help us to, again, we're still establishing the foundations here for seeing the magnificent work of Jesus on the cross and how he undoes all of this for our benefit to accomplish your task and your will. And so we just pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.